The morning they came for the house, Mabel didn't cry. She had already done that. 3 nights running, face pressed into the pillow so the neighbors wouldn't hear, crying the kind that leaves you hollow rather than relieved. By the time the banker arrived with his 2 hired men and his official leather satchel, her eyes were dry and her jaw was set. She handed over the key herself. Didn't make them ask twice. "Mrs. Turner," the banker said, with the particular tone men use when they want to sound sympathetic without actually being so. His name was Greer. She had known him for 6 years, had handed him Christmas bread each December, had waved at him across the street. There is the matter of the wagon as well. I know what there is. The inventory states, I said, I know. She pulled her shawl tighter and walked out before he finished speaking. The 2 hired men moved past her into the house she had scrubbed, painted, and repaired with her own hands for 11 years. She didn't look back. She had learned, somewhere between the funeral and the reading of the papers, that looking back cost something she couldn't afford. What she didn't expect, what blindsided her completely, was how fast a person could disappear. The women from the church auxiliary stopped calling within 2 weeks. Her neighbor Doris, who had borrowed Mabel's good iron twice and never returned it, watched from behind her curtain when Mabel walked past but didn't open the door. The dry goods owner, Mr. Hadley, spoke to her differently now. Slower, louder, like a man talking to someone faintly stupid. A widow without property was a different category of person than a widow with it. Mabel filed this information away without comment. She found work first in Sutton's Crossing, washing dishes at a boarding house from 4 in the morning until 9 at night for 3 meals and a spot on the kitchen floor. The kitchen floor was fine. She had slept on worse. What was harder to take was the boarding house owner, a wiry, permanently dissatisfied woman named Mrs. Crane, who had a habit of standing in doorways watching Mabel work with an expression like she'd bitten into something unexpectedly sour. "You spilled on the table edge again?" Mrs. Crane said one afternoon, though Mabel had not. "No, ma'am." "I see it plain as day." Mabel wrung out the cloth, looked at the dry table edge, and looked back at Mrs. Crane. "I don't know what you're seeing, but I haven't spilled anything." Mrs. Crane's eyes narrowed. "Women your size ought to be more careful moving around a kitchen." "Women my size," Mabel said evenly, "have been feeding people their whole lives." She was let go the next morning. Unsatisfactory attitude, Mrs. Crane told anyone who asked. Mabel walked 8 miles to the next town on a sprained ankle she hadn't mentioned to anyone because there was no one to mention it to. The ankle healed wrong. She could tell from the way it caught on uneven ground, a small hesitation in her stride that hadn't been there before. She added it to a growing list of things she was managing rather than fixing. The blister on her left palm from the flour sack strap, the perpetual low headache from too little water and too much sun, the way her back ached by mid-afternoon from years of bending over too short work surfaces designed for smaller women. She found work in Callaway, a hotel kitchen, better pay, longer hours. The head cook was a man named Perch, red-faced and efficient, who evaluated her at the door the way a man might evaluate a horse he was considering purchasing and wasn't sure about. "Can you handle a full service?" he asked. "I can handle whatever you put in front of me." He set her to breakfast prep and watched her work. She was fast, faster than he expected, she could tell from the way he kept glancing over. And she had the kind of economy of movement that came from years of cooking for a family on limited resources. No wasted steps, clean as she went. She had the eggs done, the biscuits in, and the gravy started before Perch had finished his coffee. "You've done this before," he said. "My whole life." He hired her at the regular wage, and she worked there for 6 weeks, which was the longest she managed to stay anywhere that year. What ended it wasn't her work. Her work was the best thing in that kitchen, and she knew it, and Perch knew it, and eventually that became its own problem, because the 2 younger cooks, boys of 19 and 20, lanky and confident in the way boys that age were, took exception to being shown up by someone who looked like Mabel Turner. It started small. Salt missing from the place she'd left it. A pot shifted to the wrong burner. Small sabotages designed to be invisible if she complained about them. She didn't complain. She worked around them. But the morning one of the boys knocked a full pot of rendered lard from the shelf. "Accidentally," he said, with that flat look boys wore when they'd done something deliberately, and it came down across her left arm. Mabel put the pot on the floor, held her burned arm to her chest, and went to find Perch. Perch looked at the burn, looked at the boy who was already building his innocent face, looked back at Mabel. "These things happen," he said. She stared at him for a long moment. "Yes," she said. "They do." She collected her wages. He at least had the decency to pay her full, and she walked out of Callaway with her flour sack and her burned arm, and 11 months of accumulated humiliation sitting somewhere behind her ribs, like a stone she couldn't dislodge. She had made a habit, without consciously deciding to, of collecting things that still had use. A dented pot she found at the side of a road east of Millhaven, the handle bent but the body sound. A wooden spoon she'd kept from the Sutton's Crossing kitchen when she left, not quite stealing. They'd have thrown it out anyway. It was split at the top and she'd seen it in the refuse pile. 3 good needles and a paper sleeve she found on the floor of a dry goods store and turned in at the counter. And when the owner shrugged and said no one would claim them, she kept them. A length of cotton twine. A decent knife with a loose handle she'd tightened herself with a strip of rawhide. And beans. She always managed to have beans. They were cheap enough even on her worst days. They kept well, and she knew 15 ways to make them worth eating. She had strong opinions about beans that she rarely got to share with anyone. By the time she reached the settlement outside of Hester's mill, she was down to about a cup of dried pinto beans, a heel of hard bread, 2 pennies, and the kind of exhaustion that went past tired into something more permanent. A worn-down feeling that settled into the bones and stayed there. The settlement was barely a settlement. 4 buildings in various states of completion, a water trough, a pen with 3 goats, and a rough camp of maybe 10 or 12 people who seemed to have stopped there for unclear reasons and not yet found reason to move on. There were families among them. She could tell by the children's voices. And a few single men with the disconnected look of people between one place and the next. She found a spot to one side of the main camp, away from the water trough, away from the fire that was already claimed by the men with the disconnected looks. She gathered what wood she could, scrub oak and cedar, smoky but sufficient, and got her own small fire going. Her dented pot. The beans she'd soaked since morning in her canteen, a trick for making them cook faster when you had limited wood. She worked with the focused quiet of someone who has learned to make a meal out of almost nothing, and she did it without making a show of it. What she had that cost nothing was knowledge. She knew when beans needed more salt and when they were hiding too much. She knew how to coax flavor out of a hard crust of bread broken up and stirred in as a thickener. She knew that a small piece of fatback, she had 1 piece, had been saving it, did more work in a pot of beans than almost anything else, releasing slowly, perfuming the whole thing with a depth that made plain food taste like intention. The smell was the thing. It moved through the camp without asking permission. She was aware of people becoming aware of her. A child appeared at the edge of her firelight, 5 or 6 years old, dirty face, watching her stir with the open-mouthed attention of a person who has recently been very hungry. Mabel didn't say anything to him. She just kept stirring. He edged slightly closer. "You can sit," she said without looking up. "I'm not going anywhere." The boy sat. It was the elderly traveler who surprised her. She hadn't noticed him settle on the far side of her fire. He was the kind of man who moved quietly, not from stealth, but simply from long practice, the way old people sometimes moved who had spent a life not wanting to impose on anyone. He was thin, with white hair cropped close, and a face so weathered it had passed through old into something harder to categorize. He carried a bedroll and a small pack, and he watched her cook with an attention that was different from the child's hunger, more considered, more particular. "That smells like something worth waiting for," he said. "It's beans." She glanced at him. "Nothing fancy." "Fancy's not the point." He tilted his head slightly. "You salted it twice. The second time was just before I sat down. Most people don't salt beans twice." She looked at him more fully now. "Most people don't notice." "I notice things," he said simply. "Name's Aldous Greer. No relation to any banker you might have met." The last part startled a short laugh out of her, an involuntary sound she hadn't made in a long time. "Mabel Turner." "May I?" She handed him the wooden spoon without being asked what he meant. He tasted the beans carefully, the way someone who actually knew food tasted things, drawing in a little air with it, sitting with it a moment before swallowing. His expression changed, not dramatically, just a quiet adjustment, like a man revising an estimate upward. "Where did you work?" he asked. Nowhere worth mentioning. That's not what I asked. She poked at the fire with a stick. Boarding houses, hotel kitchen, before that my own home for 11 years. You're wasting this, he said. He said it plainly, not unkindly, the way a person stated something they considered obvious. I'm making dinner. You're making dinner in a field with borrowed salt in a pot you found in a ditch. And it's better than most meals I've paid good money for. He handed the spoon back. That's not an accident. That's not luck. That's a particular kind of knowing that most people spend their whole lives without. Mabel looked into her pot. The beans were nearly done. She could tell by the way they were sitting in the liquid, surrendered and soft, having given up all their resistance. She thought, not for the first time that year, about the difference between what a thing was worth and what anyone was willing to pay for it. There's a ranch north of here, Aldous said. Iron Creek, Wade Callahan's operation. I've heard the name. Most people in 4 counties have. He's driven off a dozen cooks since his last one left 2 years ago. Runs the hands ragged and can't keep help for longer than a season. He paused. But it's good land, and it pays well when it pays. Why are you telling me this? He looked at her the way people looked at you when they were deciding whether you were the kind of person who could hear a real answer. Because you're sitting in a field with more talent than the best restaurant in Hester's Mill, and you're eating alone. And that seems like a waste. He shifted on the ground, adjusting some ache she could tell he was long accustomed to. Also, I used to know Callahan, before he became what he is now. What is he now? Difficult, Aldous said, with the particular weighting of someone saying the polite version. Closed up. Angry in the way men get when they're carrying grief they don't know how to put down. Mabel ladled beans into the only 2 cups she had, handed one to Aldous, beckoned the boy closer, and found a third vessel, the lid of her canteen, and filled that too, and the boy took it in both hands with a gravity that she found she couldn't look at directly. I've been turned away from plenty of places, she said. I know. And laughed at. I expect you would be, he said without flinching. At first, she ate her beans slowly, watching the fire. The settlement had gotten quieter around them. 2 of the families had gone to their bedrolls. The men with the disconnected looks had moved off somewhere. It was just her fire, the old man, the child who had fallen half asleep still holding the canteen lid. Iron Creek, she said. Iron Creek, Aldous confirmed. She thought about the road north. She thought about 11 months of wrong turns and sore feet and the particular flavor of being dismissed. She thought about Mrs. Crane's face and the hotel boy's careful carelessness with the lard pot and the way Perch had looked at her, calculating the cost of fairness and coming up short. Then she thought about what it felt like to stand at a stove and know, with the kind of certainty that needed no approval from anyone, that what she was making was good. How far? She asked. 2 days walking, 1 on a horse. I don't have a horse. Aldous nodded slowly. No, he said. I expect you don't. She cleaned her potta that night with sand from the ground, no water to spare, and wrapped it back in its cloth and slept beside her fire with her flour sack under her head. She lay on her back looking at the sky, which was the kind of sky she'd seen enough of this past year to stop finding beautiful and start finding merely large. Somewhere in the night, she made a decision. Not dramatically. There was no particular moment she could have pointed to, more like water finding its own level, the quiet logic of a woman who had run out of directions that led anywhere and was left with the one she hadn't tried. North, Iron Creek Ranch, a man known for being impossible to work for. Mabel Turner had spent 11 months being underestimated. She was, she found, no longer frightened of hard. She arrived on the 3rd day because the road was worse than Aldous had described. A washed-out bridge over a creek she had to ford with her skirts held above her knees, an unexpected stretch of heavy clay that sucked at every step and added 3 miles to her journey, and a night spent in a lean-to at the edge of a logging camp where a woman with a cook fire was treated as a public resource. She made their breakfast, 20 men, on 2 cast-iron pans with what they had available, and they were so dumbfounded that she left with a clean shirt, 2 tins of preserved peaches, and a ride on the back of a timber wagon as far as the Iron Creek Road. She saw the ranch from a distance first. It was a working operation in the way that meant no one had time to make things look nice. The main house solid and square, not gracious, built for function. The barn was new, or newer than the house, which told her something about priorities. The bunkhouse ran along the east side with a long porch where a half-dozen men were finishing their midday break, cattle in the far field, a number of horses near the water. And then she heard the laughter. She had heard that particular type of laughter enough in the past year to recognize it from a distance, the kind that started before a person had fully arrived, that established something at their expense before they'd had a chance to speak. She kept walking. Her ankle gave it small hesitation on the uneven ranch road. She kept walking anyway. The men on the porch watched her come. One of them, a big, sun-darkened man with the kind of mustache that suggested he'd had it for 20 years and intended to keep it, sat up straight to watch. Another one said something she was still too far away to catch, and two others laughed. She stopped at the base of the porch steps. "I'm looking for Wade Callahan," she said. "I'm here about the cook's position." There was a pause that had a specific quality to it, not quite silence, because the ranch sounds continued, the cattle and the wind and somewhere a door banging, but the kind of pause that was itself a comment. "The cook's position," the mustached man repeated. His voice was not unfriendly exactly, but it was the voice of a man preparing to be amused. "You're here about the cook's position." "That's what I said. We had a fellow last month, big man, trained in Denver, had letters of reference from 2 restaurants. He leaned back. Lasted 9 days. "I'm not him." "No," one of the other men said, openly grinning now. "You surely are not." Mabel kept her eyes on the mustached man because he seemed to be the one who might tell her where Callahan was, without requiring her to ask 3 more times. "Is Mr. Callahan on the property?" "He's in the barn." The mustached man stood, stretched. He was testing something. She could feel it, deciding how far this was worth playing out. "I'll tell you what, ma'am, I'll walk you over there myself, mostly because I want to see his face." "That's fine," she said. His name, she learned on the walk across the yard, was Dix. He had been at Iron Creek for 7 years, which made him the longest tenured hand on the property by 3 years. He told her this with a particular kind of pride that she recognized as the pride of a man who had survived something difficult and was not above mentioning it. "How many cooks have there been?" she asked. "Since Mrs. Callahan passed?" He thought about it. 14. 15 if you count the one who left before lunch on his first day. "What happened to her?" "Mrs. Callahan." His stride shortened slightly. "Fire," he said, and left it at that. She filed this away. Beside the other things she was filing. Building a picture the way she always did when she walked into a new situation. Assembling information before she needed it. The habit of a woman who had learned that walking into a room without knowing what she was walking into was how you ended up burned, literally or otherwise. The barn was dim after the afternoon sun. It smelled of hay and horses and the specific sweetness of large animals in a closed space, which she had always found she didn't mind. At the far end, a man was working on a horse's left rear shoe, crouched low, having a conversation with the horse that the horse was participating in, with ear movements and the occasional skeptical exhalation. "Boss," Dick said. "Got someone here about the cooking position." The man didn't look up immediately. He finished what he was doing with the shoe, set it down, gave the horse's leg a brief pat, and stood, turned around. Wade Callahan was not what she'd expected, though she couldn't have said exactly what she had expected. He was 45 or near it, lean the way working men were lean, used up, she thought, rather than spare. His face had lines that went deeper than weather. His eyes were the washed gray of a sky after the storm has passed and isn't sure whether to clear. He looked at her the way the mustached man had looked at her. The same quick calibration, but without the preparing to be amused quality. His was more direct, more accustomed to looking at things and deciding fast. "You're here about the cook position," he said. "Word spreads," she said. His mouth moved, not quite a smile. "You cook at all?" "I've been cooking since I was 8 years old." "Where?" "My own house for 11 years. 3 commercial kitchens before that fell apart." She didn't offer more detail on the falling apart. "I can cook for 20 men. I can cook for 40 if I have to. I've worked fast and I've worked clean, and I've never once put a bad plate in front of someone who wasn't trying to get rid of me." Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, not yet, but a slight recalibration, like the horse with the ear movements. "My last cook left because I have standards." "I have standards too," she said. They're probably different from yours, but I'm willing to find out where they overlap. Dix behind her made a sound that might have been a surprised laugh that he converted into a cough at the last moment. Callahan looked at her for a long moment. The barn was quiet around them. The horse shifted its weight and glanced at her with the mild, appraising expression horses sometimes had that was oddly easy to read. 1 week trial, he said. I'm not paying until I decide to keep you, and I might decide not to. I need a place to sleep, and I need access to the kitchen to prove what I said. There's a room off the cookhouse, cot and a window. That's sufficient. You'll start at 4:30 in the morning. I generally start at 4, she said, but 4:30 is fine. He nodded once, the nod of a man concluding a transaction, not of a man making her feel welcome. He turned back to the horse. Dix'll show you the kitchen. She followed Dix back out into the afternoon sun. The men on the porch were watching. She didn't look at them long enough to give the watching any satisfaction. You know what you're walking into? Dix said quietly as they crossed to the cookhouse. Tell me anyway. He hasn't had a civil evening meal since 1871. The hands eat fast and hard and don't care much what it tastes like anymore, which is a worse sign than you might think. The kitchen's decent, but nobody's taken care of it, and he... Dix paused, opened the cookhouse door. He tests people. Doesn't mean to, I think. Just doesn't know another way. She looked into the kitchen. It was, as Dix said, decent. Good stove, iron, and substantial. Work table scarred but solid. The pans were stacked wrong and the dry storage was disordered, and someone had left a pan to soak that had been soaking long enough to have opinions about it. But the bones were good. He can test all he wants, she said. She moved to the work table and ran her hand along the grain, assessing. I've been tested by worse than him and I'm still standing. Dix nodded slowly, with the look of a man who had decided something. 4:30, he said. Tell them 4, Mabel said. I'll have something worth waking up for. She started cleaning the kitchen before dinner because there was no point in cooking in a space you hadn't made your own. She had the soaking pan dealt with, the dry goods sorted by type and frequency of use, and the stove cleaned of its accumulated deposits before dark. She checked the pantry inventory carefully, mentally cataloging, planning, and found more to work with than she'd expected. She lay on the cot in the small room off the cookhouse that night and looked at the ceiling and did not let herself think past the morning. Not about whether she would last a week, not about the men on the porch or Callahan's measuring eyes or the 14 cooks before her, not about the year behind her, its accumulated indignities, its hard roads. Just the morning, the stove, the 20-some men who had come through that door tired and hungry and prepared to be disappointed. She knew what she was going to make. She had known since the pantry. She was going to make them something they weren't expecting, and it was going to be enough, and it was going to be hers. That was sufficient for now. That was enough to sleep on. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in nearly a year, she slept without dreaming of the road. She was up at 3:45. Not because she'd set anything. She had no clock in the small room off the cookhouse, just the window and whatever light came through it. But because her body had its own schedule built from years of early mornings, and it didn't care that she was in a strange place on a strange cot with a strange arrangement that might fall apart in a week. It woke her up the same way it always had, with a sudden alertness that had nothing gradual about it. The way some people rose and some people just arrived at consciousness, already moving. She lay still for a moment in the dark. Listened. The ranch had its own sounds at that hour. Cattle somewhere distant. A horse shifting in the barn. Wind coming off the hills to the north with a different quality than the day wind. Softer but more persistent. She could hear, faintly, someone in the bunkhouse snoring. She got up, dressed, and went into the kitchen. She had left it clean. Not the performed cleanliness of someone trying to make an impression, but the functional cleanliness of a person who needed to be able to find things in the dark and couldn't afford the 10 seconds of searching for a misplaced spoon at 4 in the morning. Every surface in its place, every pan where her hand would reach for it. She had reorganized the whole kitchen the night before, working until her back ached and her burned arm, still tight at the wrist where the scar was finishing its healing, pulled in the way it did when she'd been using it too long. She got the stove going first. The kindling caught easy. Good dry wood, she'd noted that the night before, whoever sourced the wood knew what they were doing. And she worked the damper until she had the heat she wanted. Then she stood at the work table in the growing warmth and thought about what she was making. She had decided in the night. Biscuits, but not the flat, dense kind that came from a cook who was going through motions. Hers were layered, almost flaky, worked with cold lard in a way that took more time than most people bothered with. Gravy from the drippings she'd found in a crock, which were good quality and told her the cattle here were well fed. Fried potatoes with onion and a little pepper, because men who worked cattle needed more than flour to get through the morning. And eggs scrambled soft. Not the rubbery, exhausted eggs she'd been served at half the places she'd worked, but eggs pulled from the heat a moment before they were done, still slightly loose, that finished cooking in their own warmth on the way to the plate. It wasn't complicated food. It wasn't fancy. But there was a difference between food that fueled a man and food that made him feel, for 10 minutes, like he was somewhere worth being. And she knew how to make the second kind, and she did. The first man through the door was Dix. He came in at 4:50, half asleep and moving by habit, and stopped short when the smell hit him. He stood in the doorway for a moment with his hat in his hands. "You started early," he said. "I start at 4, she said. "I told you." He sat down without being invited, and she put a plate in front of him before he'd fully settled. He looked at it, really looked, which she noticed, which told her something, and then he picked up his fork and ate without saying anything for a full minute. She kept working, plating for the rest of them, not watching him, but aware of him the way you were always aware of the first test. "These biscuits," he said finally. "What about them?" "What did you do to them?" "Made them properly," she said. He ate the rest of it with the focused attention of a man who had been eating bad food for long enough that good food required his full concentration. The other men came in 2 and 3 at a time, loud and half awake, and dragging chairs, and she put plates down the length of the table and watched the room change. The loudness settled into eating. The shuffling settled into stillness. A young hand, couldn't have been more than 18, freckled, with the cautious eyes of someone who'd been told not to expect much, took a bite of the scrambled eggs and looked up at her like she'd done something he wanted explained. She didn't explain. She refilled his plate. Callahan came in last. He had the look of a man who had already been working. There was dirt on his forearms, and he'd pushed his sleeves up, and he sat at the far end of the table, where she gathered he always sat, a little separate from the hands in the way bosses were. The separation maintained not because he insisted on it, but because the men maintained it for him. He looked at the plate she set in front of him. He looked at her. He didn't say anything. He ate slowly, which was different from the hands. Not slowly because he was savoring it, or not only that, but slowly in the way of a man paying attention to something he hadn't expected to pay attention to. When he was done, he pushed the plate forward slightly and drank his coffee. He still didn't say anything. She didn't ask. It became the shape of their mornings. The first 3 days were a negotiation she was conducting mostly with herself. She learned the kitchen's rhythms, when the heat was reliable, which burner ran hot, how the oven behaved in different weather. She learned the hands, Dick's, who was steady and fair. The young freckled one whose name was Petey, and who had apparently eaten so many indifferent meals in the past year that he'd stopped expecting food to taste like anything in particular. A man named Cortez, who ate twice as much as anyone else and never mentioned it. 3 brothers named Hatch. No one ever used their first names, they were just the Hatch boys, who came in together and left together and had the clannish solidarity of men who had been each other's only reliable company for too long. And she learned what she was working against. The kitchen had a backlog of neglect that went beyond the surface disorder she'd already addressed. The bread oven had a crack in the door seal that lost heat and meant everything took longer than it should. 2 of the better pans were warped, usable, but inefficient. The spice situation was disorganized in a specific way that told her whoever had been ordering supplies had been doing it without a list, just buying what they remembered was low, which meant there were 3 tins of paprika and no time. She improvised around it, made note of what was needed, and kept her complaints to herself because there was no one to complain to, and she'd learned that particular lesson thoroughly. On the 4th morning, Petey lingered after the others had gone. He stood near the door with his hat in his hand. The same posture as Dick's on the first morning, she was starting to think it was the ranch's particular version of not knowing what to do with yourself. And he said, "Ma'am, can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "That thing you made yesterday, the bean soup." He hesitated. "My mother used to make something like that." She looked at him. He was young enough to still carry his homesickness close to the surface, not yet old enough to have buried it properly the way men eventually did. Different recipe, she said, but beans are beans. Where's your mother? Missouri. Long way. Yeah. He turned his hat in his hands. I just wanted to say that it was, you know. He gave up on finding the word. Good. Thank you, Petey. He nodded, still not quite meeting her eyes, and left. She watched him go across the yard toward the barn and felt something small and persistent settle in her chest. Not happiness exactly, more like the specific satisfaction of a thing being what it was supposed to be. She'd been making food for people for most of her life, and this was still why she did it. Not for Callahan's approval or Mrs. Crane's opinion or the hotel boy's willingness to let her work in peace. For the thing that happened when food made a person feel, for a moment, like someone was looking out for them. She went back to work. The end of the fourth day was when the first real trouble started, and it came from a direction she hadn't fully prepared for. His name was Garrett, and she had placed him at the edge of her awareness from the beginning, the way you place certain men, the ones who had a default towards contempt that required an outlet, and who were still deciding where to direct it. He was older than the Hatch boys, younger than Dick's, with a thick neck and the permanent squint of someone who spent a lot of time outdoors or a lot of time looking for reasons to be offended, and she was honestly uncertain which it was. He had been quieter than she expected through the first 3 days, eating what she put in front of him without comment, which she'd taken as neutral. But on the fourth evening, when she was serving dinner, a beef stew that she'd built over most of the afternoon, slow and careful, with root vegetables and a depth of flavor that came from not rushing it. He pushed his bowl to the side after one spoonful. The table noticed. Conversations didn't stop, but they thinned. Something wrong with it? She asked from where she was standing. Didn't say that. You pushed it away. I can push a bowl wherever I like, he said, and there it was. The prepared offense, the tone that was looking for a place to land. Maybe I'm not hungry. Then you don't have to eat it, she said. Maybe I don't like how it's made. She looked at him directly. The table had gone quiet enough now that there was no pretending this was a private exchange. What specifically don't you like? I like my food straightforward. He leaned back in his chair, something performative in the lean. Not fussed over by someone who thinks they're better than a ranch kitchen. I don't think I'm better than a ranch kitchen, she said, with the particular flatness of a woman who has had this specific conversation too many times in too many forms to be surprised by it anymore. I work in one. You walked in here off the road with a flour sack. I did. And now you're in here acting like you're something, and I'm saying there's some that don't see it that way. Dix had set his spoon down. The Hatch boys were very still. Petey was looking at the table with the expression of a young man who was working out whether he was brave enough to say something. Mabel picked up the bowl from in front of Garrett, walked back to the stove, and ladled a full portion back into the pot without a word. She put the empty bowl down at the end of the washboard. Stew will be here if you change your mind, she said. It's better when it cools a little anyway. It wasn't a defeat, and it wasn't a victory. It was a refusal to accept the terms of the argument he was offering, and from the look on Garrett's face, it landed exactly as she'd intended. Not as surrender, but as a kind of dismissal that was harder to argue with than anger would have been. Dix picked his spoon back up. The room gradually returned to itself. Later, washing up, she was aware that her hands were shaking slightly and had been for a while. She had gotten better at not showing it. But on the fifth day, Callahan came into the kitchen mid-morning. This was unusual. She had gathered that his presence at meals was the extent of the overlap between his world and the kitchen's world, that he ran the ranch from the outside and the inside largely sorted itself. She was elbow deep in the bread she was making for the week. Actual bread, not the hard traveling kind, but proper loaves that needed time and attention. And she heard the door and looked up, and there he was. He stood just inside the doorway, which she had noticed was his default position in any room. Not quite committing to entry, one foot still available to withdraw. He looked at the table covered in flour, the 2 loaves already shaped and resting, the one she was currently working. I need to talk to you about the supply order, he said. All right. Cortez usually handles it, but he said you had a list. She had made the list on her second day, written on the back of a paper bag she'd found in the storage room. She wiped her hands on her apron, found the list, and handed it to him. He read it standing there in the doorway, his face doing the thing it did. The careful nothing, the deliberate withholding of response. Time, he said. There isn't any. We had time. You have 3 tins of paprika, she said. You have no thyme, no bay leaves, and the nutmeg is so old it doesn't smell like anything anymore. He read further. This is double the usual order. It's what's needed. The usual order is sufficient. She looked at him with the patience she kept in reserve for this type of conversation. The type where a man had a number in his head and intended to defend it regardless of evidence. Mr. Callahan, I've been feeding 20 men 3 times a day for 5 days on what's in that pantry. I've done it, and I've done it well. But I've been working around gaps that your previous cooks were also working around, and that's why your food has tasted the way it has. Something moved in his expression, not enough to read fully. The usual order, he started. Your usual order, she said, is set up for a cook who is keeping bodies alive, not making food worth eating. If you want the first, cut my list in half and I'll manage. If you want what I've been making this week, approve the list. She held his gaze. That's not an ultimatum. That's just the arithmetic. He looked at the list again. She went back to her bread, working it, pressing the heel of her hand into the dough, turning it, pressing again, because letting bread sit while you stood around waiting for a man to decide something was its own kind of defeat. I'll approve it, he said. She nodded, didn't look up. He was at the door when he stopped. She was aware of the pause before he spoke, and it had a different quality than his usual pauses. Less calculated, more like a man catching himself saying something before he fully meant to. The biscuits this week, he said. My wife used to make biscuits like that. She kept working the bread. Did she? Yes. A pause. I'd forgotten, that's all. She heard the door close behind him. She kept working, but her hand slowed for a moment, just slightly, and she thought about the 14 cooks before her and what Dix had said about the fire, and the way Callahan stood in doorways like a man who hadn't quite decided whether to be anywhere. She thought about Petey's mother in Missouri, about her own husband, who had liked her soup the way she made it, and had never told her about the debts until after he was gone and couldn't be asked about them. About Aldous sitting across a fire eating beans from a canteen lid. She thought about what a person carried, and how it changed the shape of them, and how you could sometimes see it in someone you just met, the way you could see the shape of the wind in a field of grass, even when the wind itself was invisible. She finished the bread, shaped it, set it to rise, and went out to haul water for the afternoon. The 6th day was the one that nearly broke her, and it had nothing to do with Callahan or Garrett or the supply order or anything she'd prepared herself for. It was a Tuesday, which meant laundry in addition to meals, and Mabel had taken on the ranch's laundry as an extra. Not required, not asked for, just something she'd seen needed doing. The Hatch brothers were wearing shirts they'd been wearing for 2 weeks by smell alone. She had taken on the job quietly, the same way she'd taken on restocking the lamp oil and replacing the frayed rope on the well bucket, without announcement, because the doing of it was its own announcement. But laundry on top of 3 meals for 20 men was a lot, and her back had been troubling her since the morning. A deep grinding ache in the lower right side that she recognized as the warning sign before the kind of day when standing at a stove for 6 hours extracted a price she'd have to pay later. She paid it. She paid it through the morning service and through the laundry and through the lunch service without letting anything show, because the cost of letting it show was a question about whether she could handle the work. And she could handle the work, she just couldn't handle it and also have a conversation about it. It was Dix who noticed. He found her at the well mid-afternoon, doing the next load of wringing, and he looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who had been around working people long enough to recognize when one of them was hurting. "You're back," he said. "It's fine." "Right." He crouched down beside the laundry basket without making a production of it. "I'll do the wringing. You can hang." "I don't need—" "I know you don't." He picked up the shirt she'd been wringing and did it with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done ranch laundry himself for years. "Just let me help." She stood up slowly, one hand on the well edge, and let him. It was harder than it should have been. Not the standing up, but the letting. She had spent 11 months being not helped, and the muscle memory of refusing had gotten deep. They worked the rest of the laundry in silence, mostly, and it was a comfortable silence, the kind between people who have established that they're not a threat to each other. "You're going to stay," Dick said, not as a question. "He hasn't said yet." "He will." He shook out a pair of trousers, handed her the end. "I've seen every cook who's come through here. Most of them lasted 3 days before he said something that drove them off. The Denver man with the references lasted 9 days, and that's because he had enough confidence to absorb a fair amount of rudeness before it stuck." He paused. "You're at 6 days and you haven't flinched once." "I flinched," she said, "up to it, just not in front of anyone." He glanced at her sideways, something that might have been a smile. "That's exactly what I mean," he said. That evening, after dinner had been served and cleared and she was doing the final cleanup of the night, Callahan appeared in the doorway again. He had the same quality he'd had in the morning, hovering at the threshold. But this time he came fully in, sat down at the far end of the table, the way he sat at meals. She kept washing up. "The week's up tomorrow," he said. "I know. I've had one complaint. Garrett. You know about that. I'm in the kitchen. I hear things." She rinsed a pan, set it to drain. Was it a real complaint or a complaint? Something in his jaw shifted, the closest she'd seen him come to humor. "A complaint," he said. "He doesn't like change, gets his back up when things are different than he expects." "Most people do," she said. "They just manage it differently." He was quiet for a moment. "The men are different this week. Dick's told me you're doing the laundry too." "Someone was going to have to." "That's not your job." "I know." He looked at her across the kitchen, and for the first time she felt like he was actually looking at her rather than at the question of whether she was going to work out. It was a small difference, but a real one. "I'm going to offer you the position," he said. "Permanent. Better wages than the trial rate." She put down the last pan and turned around. "All right. I have conditions." "So do I," she said. That surprised him. She could see it, a brief recalibration, the slight widening of attention. "Let's hear yours first," he said. "The bread oven needs the door seal replaced. I'll keep working around it, but it should be fixed. The spice order goes through me from now on, and Garrett stays out of the kitchen unless he's eating." Callahan looked at her for a longer moment. "I can do 2 of those things," he said. "Which 2? "The oven seal and the spice order." He paused. "Garrett works here. I can't keep him out of the kitchen." "Then tell him to keep his opinions about how I cook to himself." "I'll tell him," Callahan said. "Whether he listens is between you and him." It wasn't the agreement she wanted, but it was the honest version of what he could deliver, and she appreciated the honesty more than she would have appreciated a promise he intended to let slide. "My conditions," he said. "You tell me when something in the kitchen needs fixing before it becomes a problem. You don't take on extra work without telling me you're doing it. The laundry. If you'd hurt yourself at the well today, I'd have been down a cook and a laundress, and I wouldn't have known why." He said it plainly, without accusation, but there was something underneath it. Not irritation exactly, more like the specific frustration of a man who had learned the cost of not knowing things too late. "You work here, I need to know what you're doing. That's not about permission. That's about the ranch running." She thought about this. It was reasonable, or it was at least a reasonable version of something that could have been stated unreasonably, and she was practiced enough at the difference. "Fine," she said. "I'll tell you." He nodded, stood, moved toward the door with the particular movement of a man concluding a conversation who was privately relieved it had concluded the way it had. At the door he stopped. His stopping there was becoming a pattern she was beginning to read. And he said, without turning, "The bread today was the best thing I've eaten in 2 years." He didn't wait for her to respond. The door closed. She stood in the kitchen for a moment in the quiet. The lamp was burning low and the stove had settled into its nighttime ticking, and outside the wind had picked up and was working at the eaves with the particular persistence that meant weather coming. She thought about 2 years, about what 2 years without something you'd taken for granted felt like from the inside. She knew something about that. Not the same something, but adjacent to it. She turned back to the last of the dishes, finished them, and dried her hands. She had a job. A real one, with wages and a room and conditions that had been negotiated and heard. She had a kitchen that was becoming hers in the way kitchens became yours, through the arrangement of the spices, the knowledge of the oven's moods, the particular memory in your hands of how the work table's surface felt at 4 in the morning. It wasn't safe. Exactly. Safety was a word she'd stopped trusting to mean what it was supposed to mean. But it was solid ground under her feet. She blew out the lamp and went to bed, and outside the wind kept working at the eaves, steady and building, the way weather did when it had decided it was coming, regardless of whether you were ready for it. The weather that had been working at the eaves all week finally made good on its threat on a Thursday in late October. Mabel felt it before she saw it. The morning had a particular quality to it, a pressure behind the air, the sky the color of old pewter, in a way that wasn't about rain so much as about something larger gathering itself. She'd grown up in country that had weather like this, the kind that didn't announce itself politely. She mentioned it to Dix when he came in for breakfast. "Storm coming," she said. He looked out the window over his coffee. "Been dry all month." "Doesn't matter, something's building." She put his plate down. "The cattle in the north pasture, are they—" "We'll move them this morning if it looks serious." "It looks serious now," she said. He studied the sky a moment longer with the expression of a man weighing two kinds of expertise against each other. His years of reading this specific land against her years of reading weather in general. He finished his coffee, pushed back from the table. "I'll tell Callahan." She watched him cross the yard, and she watched Callahan come out of the main house and look at the same sky she'd been looking at, and she watched his face do its careful nothing, and she thought, not for the first time, that whatever was behind that careful nothing was doing considerable work. The morning proceeded. She baked. She prepped the noon meal. She hauled water with one eye on the horizon, where the clouds had the density of something that had already decided. By mid-morning, the wind had shifted, a definite, purposeful shift, from the west to the northwest, colder and carrying the particular smell that preceded serious weather. The cattle were moved, the horses were brought in, the loose equipment in the yard was secured or stowed. By early afternoon, the first thunder came. Distant, exploratory, the kind that was feeling out the acoustics of the valley. Mabel banked the stove carefully. Not down, but regulated, the way you banked a fire when you might need to leave it for a while. And she stood in the cookhouse doorway and watched the sky turn the color of a bruise at the western edge. She'd lived through bad storms before. She knew the difference between the kind that announced themselves dramatically and passed in an hour and the kind that were quiet about their intentions until they weren't. This one had been quiet for 2 days. The lightning started around 3 in the afternoon. It came in long, flat strikes rather than the vertical kind, which was worse. More ground contact, more spread. She heard the crack of the first close one from inside the cookhouse and felt it in her back teeth, and she put down the knife she was holding and went to the door. The barn. She saw it in the same moment she heard Petey shouting from somewhere across the yard. A tongue of flame on the barn's east face, near the hayloft, small enough that it looked like it could be managed, but moving the way fire moved when the wind had decided to help it, fast and purposeful and ungoverned. She was running before she'd consciously decided to run. The yard was chaos of a specific operational kind. Men moving toward the barn, then hesitating, then moving again. The way people moved when they could see a problem clearly, but hadn't gotten the instruction their body needed to commit to a direction. The wind was strong enough now that she had to lean into it. She reached the water trough at the barn's north side, the one she'd been hauling from all week, the one whose rope she'd replaced, and she turned back to look for who was in charge of doing something with it. What she saw stopped her for a half second. Wade Callahan was standing at the edge of the yard, not moving, not giving orders. Standing with a stillness that was completely wrong for the situation. Not the stillness of a man calculating, but the stillness of a man who had gone somewhere else inside himself, somewhere that the fire had taken him to without asking. She'd heard it from Dix in short, careful sentences. A fire. His wife. 1871. She had not heard the details and hadn't asked because people's grief was their own until they chose to share it. But she understood, looking at him now, that what she was seeing wasn't cowardice. It was a man who had walked back into the worst moment of his life and lost his footing. The problem was that the barn was on fire and someone needed to be in charge of the next 30 seconds. Mabel turned to the yard. Dix! Her voice came out with a carrying force she hadn't entirely known she had. Water chain from the north trough to the east wall. 6 men. You, Cortez, and the hatch boys start there. Move. She was already looking for Petey. Petey, the horses. Which ones are still in? 2 mares in the gray gelding, Mabel. They won't. I know. Get a wet cloth from the cookhouse, tie it around the lead rope. Take the mares first because they're calmer. Don't go in alone. She grabbed the arm of a man she knew only as Reyes. He was solid and fast, and she'd watched him work for weeks. You're with him. She turned to the remaining men, which was Garrett, and 2 others whose names she was less certain of. Garrett was looking at her with an expression she had seen before, the expression of a man arriving at a moment where he had to choose between his feelings about a person and the operational reality in front of him. It was not a graceful expression. It was the expression of someone discovering that the situation had made his previous position untenable and not being happy about it. Garrett, she said, the feed storage on the south end. That catches, we lose the whole barn. Wet down the south wall now. He went. He went without a word, which was the best she could have hoped for. The next 20 minutes were the longest of her life, and she spent them moving. The fire had spread from the hayloft to the upper eaves on the east face, which meant they were fighting it on 2 levels simultaneously. The water chain was hitting the wall below, slowing the spread downward, but the eave fire was moving horizontally, and the wind was pushing it toward the main section of the roof. She could see it from the yard. She could do the arithmetic of it. If the roof caught the center section, where the load-bearing beams were, old wood, dried out, the whole thing came down. The roof, she said to Dix, who had come back to refill. We need someone up there. He looked at her. He looked at the roof. He was not a young man, and she could see him calculating. The ladder on the north side, but the angle... I know the angle. She looked at him. I'm not asking you to go up. Mabel, I'm lighter than you, and I've been climbing since I could walk. This was not a complete truth. She had gained considerable weight since she'd last climbed anything significant. But the principle was sound enough, and there was no time for complete truths. She was partway up the north ladder before he could finish whatever he'd been about to say. The roof was worse than she'd thought. The shingles were older than they looked from below, dried to the point where the heat from the eave fire was already causing them to curl in smoke before the flame reached them. The wind up here was substantial. It pushed at her with the blunt persistence of something that didn't know she was a person and not an obstacle. She moved on her hands and knees, which was humiliating and necessary, distributing her weight carefully, feeling for the sounds that would tell her if a beam was compromised. Someone handed up a bucket from below. She didn't look to see who. She could hear the grunt of effort and the rattle of the chain. She took it and worked across the smoking section of shingles, pouring and distributing, working methodically from the outer edge toward the center because the center was what mattered. Her arms were burning. The burn on her wrist, the hotel kitchen scar, the one that pulled in cold weather, pulled now in a different way, the heat from below contracting it. She kept going. She poured water, and she breathed the smoke, and she worked, and she did not look down, because looking down was not something she could afford right now. Mabel. The voice was from below and to her left, and she knew it without looking. Callahan. He was at the base of the ladder, his face angled up, and he had come back from wherever the fire had taken him. She could see it in his face, even from this height, that he had returned to himself, that something had broken and reset. He looked at her on the roof with an expression she couldn't name, and he said, "Tell me what you need." "More water to the east face," she said. "Steady pressure, not pulsed. And someone on the west side with a wet blanket on the base of the silo." The silo was the thing they couldn't afford to lose, the grain stores for winter. The wind is shifting. If it shifts 10 more degrees, the silo's at risk. He nodded once and moved. She heard him take charge of the yard below, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had been born knowing how to run something. And she let herself breathe for a half second and then went back to work. The fire on the east eave reached its peak about 10 minutes after she got on the roof. She could feel it in the heat and in the sound. Fire at its height had a particular deep, settled roar, like it had found its footing and was considering where to go next. And then the water hit it from 2 sides at once, Dix's chain on the wall and Cortez from an angle she hadn't assigned, improvised. Because Cortez was the kind of worker who understood systems instinctively and had found the gap himself. The fire didn't go out. Fires didn't go out that cleanly. But it stuttered. It pulled back to a smaller, meaner version of itself, and smaller meant manageable. And manageable was all she'd been asking for. She came down the ladder on her third attempt. Her arms gave on the second, which she hadn't expected, or had expected but had set aside in the category of things to deal with later. She backed down the final 6 rungs purely on leg strength, which was more reliable, and stepped off the bottom rung onto solid ground and stood there for a moment with her hands on the ladder rails, just breathing. The yard was soaked. The men were soaked. The east barn wall was scorched and blackened across a section of maybe 12 feet. The hayloft opening darkened and smoking, the eave above it gone entirely. The barn was standing. The silo was untouched. The horses were in the small paddock. She could see Petey standing with one of the mares, one hand on her neck, talking to her quietly. The other mare was at the fence. The gray gelding was pacing but contained. She released the ladder rails. "You're bleeding," Dick said from beside her, and she looked at her left hand and found he was right. A gash across the palm, from something on the roof she hadn't noticed at the time, which was the way injuries worked when the situation was loud enough that your body withheld the information until later. It wasn't deep. It was messy. "I'm all right," she said. "You're not, but all right." He produced a cloth from somewhere. She didn't ask where, and she wrapped her hand herself because the alternative was standing still while someone did it for her, and standing still didn't feel achievable yet. The sky had gone a strange, exhausted color. The storm wasn't over. The clouds were still moving overhead with purpose. But the worst of the lightning had passed east, and the wind was dropping to something merely serious rather than destructive. The smoke from the barn curled up and was taken away to the northeast. She became aware, gradually, of the specific quality of the quiet that had settled over the yard. Not the quiet of people resting, the quiet of people looking at her. The Hatch boys were by the water trough, wrung out and dripping, and they were looking at her. Cortez was standing with his arms hanging at his sides, his face a complicated landscape of exhaustion and something else. Petey, from the paddock, had his hand still on the mare's neck but his eyes on Mabel. Reyes and the 2 men, whose names she didn't know as well, were by the south wall, and they were looking. Garrett was by the silo. He had a wet blanket over one shoulder that he'd been using on the south wall, and his face was red from the heat and dirty from the smoke, and very still in a way that was different from his previous stillnesses, which had been the stillness of a man choosing to withhold himself. This was something else. She couldn't read it fully. But he didn't look away when she looked at him. She looked at all of them and felt the weight of the looking and didn't know what to do with it exactly. She was not accustomed to being looked at in this particular way. Not the inventory look she'd lived with her whole adult life. Not the dismissal look. Not the prepared to be amused look. This was different, and she needed a moment to place it. "The barn needs to stay wet through the night," she said, because saying the next necessary thing was how she handled moments she didn't have a category for. "Rotating shifts on the water. Dix, can you organize that?" "Already in my head," he said. "The horses need to stay in the paddock, not the barn. Petey, they'll be all right out there if the weather holds." "Yes, ma'am." "Dinner will be late." She looked at the group. "Hour and a half. There's bread from this morning. I'll put it out now." She walked toward the cookhouse. Her hand was throbbing. Her arms felt like someone had removed the bones and replaced them with something less reliable. Her back, which had been troubling her before the fire started and which she had completely forgotten about during it, had returned with specific opinions. She was at the cookhouse door when she heard him behind her. "Mabel." She stopped, turned. Callahan was 10 feet away. He had come from the direction of the silo. She could see the path he'd taken through the wet yard, his boots dark with mud. And he was looking at her with that washed gray gaze and an expression she had not seen on him before and was working to categorize. It was the expression of a man who had lost something and found it wasn't where he expected, and who was standing at the intersection of gratitude and something that cost more to name. "The barn," he said. Then he stopped. She waited. He started again. "The roof. You didn't have to—" He stopped a second time. She could see the difficulty of it. A man who had built thick walls trying to find the door, not sure he still knew where it was. "That was my job," he said, "taking charge of that. It was my job and I—" His jaw tightened. "I didn't do it." She looked at him for a moment. The yard was around them still, men moving to their various tasks, but in the particular way of working people who were giving two people space while appearing not to. "You came back," she said. "Too late." "You came back." She said it again, not to be kind, but because it was accurate and accuracy mattered to her. "And you ran the yard for the last 10 minutes of it, and the silo is standing." She shifted her wrapped hand. "Nobody does everything right in a fire." "You did," he said. She shook her head. "I did what I knew how to do in the moment I had to do it. I didn't freeze because I haven't lost anyone in a fire." She held his gaze. "You have." The thing that happened to his face then was not dramatic. It was the opposite of dramatic. A small, almost invisible collapse of something that had been held rigid for a very long time. A brief unguarding. There and then controlled again, but not entirely reversed. Like a seam giving on a garment that had been pulled too tight for too long. He looked away across the yard, looked back. "How did you know?" "Dick said what happened to your wife. Not the whole of it, just enough." She paused. "I'm sorry." He nodded once. The nod of a man receiving information that he had learned to receive without going apart from it. Practiced and still raw underneath. The two things at once. He was quiet for a moment. "Clara," he said. It seemed like he hadn't intended to say the name. It came out with the quality of something kept in a closed room. "Clara," Mabel repeated. "She—" He stopped. Looked at his hands, which were dirty from the night's work. It was the house, not a barn. We were running a smaller operation then, east of here. A lamp went over in the night. He said it with the particular flatness of someone reciting a thing they've said before, or perhaps never said before, but have rehearsed without knowing it. "I was in the field. By the time I—" He stopped. By the time. She didn't fill the silence. She let it stand because that was what it deserved. "I saw the barn," he said, "and I was—" He made a short, frustrated gesture with one hand, the gesture of a man who doesn't have the vocabulary for what happened to him. "I was there, and then I was somewhere else, and I couldn't—" He looked at her. "I couldn't come back." "Until you did," she said. "Until I did." He said it slowly, like he was testing whether it was true, whether the fact of having come back eventually was something that could be separated from the fact of having left. Does that count for anything? She thought about this with the seriousness it deserved. "I think," she said, "that it counts for the thing it counts for, which is that you're still here and the silo's intact and nobody died." She leaned against the doorframe, because her legs had been carrying her for several hours now and had thoughts about it. It doesn't count for being everything you wanted to be in that moment, but that's not the same as counting for nothing. He absorbed this. He had the quality of a man who had been braced for condemnation and wasn't sure what to do with the absence of it, the way a person leaned forward into a wind that had unexpectedly stopped. "Your hand," he said. "I know. We have supplies in the main house. I'll manage it in the cookhouse. Mabel." He said her name the way a person said it when they meant stop arguing with me for a moment, which she recognized as a mode of speech she had used herself on occasion. "Let me get the supplies. Let someone do one thing." She looked at him. He was filthy and tired and had been somewhere very dark tonight and come back from it, and he was standing in his own muddy yard asking to bring her bandaging supplies, and something about the specific ordinariness of that, the smallness of what he was asking to give, made her throat tighten in a way she hadn't expected. "All right," she said. He came back with a small wooden box that had the organized contents of a man who had learned to be prepared for injuries the hard way. He set it on the cookhouse work table. Her work table, she thought of it that way now, and he unwrapped the cloth from her hand himself, which she let him do, and he looked at the cut with the calm, methodical attention he brought to ranch problems, the fence line and the water source, and now this. "Not deep," he said. "I said that. But long." He cleaned it with the movements of a man who had dealt with cuts before, his own and other people's. And she watched his face while he worked and found it easier to look at him now than it had been any other time, because they were both tired enough to have dropped the particular performance people did when they were being observed. "You were on the roof," he said, working. "Yes. I saw you from the yard. When I came back to myself, you were—" He paused, choosing the word with more care than he usually took with words. You weren't afraid. I was afraid, she said. I was afraid the whole time. He looked up from her hand briefly. You didn't act it. Acting afraid doesn't help a roof fire. She watched him press a folded cloth against the cut, applying pressure with a steadiness that was different from how he usually touched things, more careful. Afraid is just information. You take it in and you decide what you're doing anyway. He was quiet, holding the cloth in place. The cookhouse was warm from the banked stove, and the rain had started. Finally, actual rain, coming against the window in the steady, committed way of rain that had been working up to this all day. Clara was afraid of fire, he said very quietly, the way people said things they'd never said out loud before. After the first summer here, when there was a grass fire on the south end, she was never easy around it after that. He watched his own hands. I used to think that was something that eventually she'd get past it, that I could do something to make it less. He paused. I didn't understand that fear isn't always a problem to fix. Mabel was quiet. I've been trying to fix things for 4 years, he said. The ranch, the herd, He stopped. Everything except the thing that can't be fixed. No, she said gently. That one you just carry. He looked at her. She held his gaze. I know something about carrying things, she said. Not the same things as you, but the weight of it, yes. You learn what you can put down and what you can't, and you stop spending so much energy trying to put down the things that won't go. He held the cloth for another moment, then carefully wrapped her hand with the bandaging from the box. Not perfectly. The wrapping had the amateur quality of a man doing a job he'd taught himself, and he tied it off and sat back. The barn's going to need work, he said. The shift back to practical things was its own kind of communication. She recognized it as the closing of a door that had been opened further than he usually opened it. Not a rejection, but a return to ground he knew. East wall in the loft, she said, accepting the shift. The structural beams on that side will need an inspection before anyone works in the loft again. I'll get someone in. The hayloft hay is a loss. Whatever didn't burn, soaked. I know. He closed the wooden box. You need to rest. I have dinner still to... Mabel. That tone again, the stop arguing tone. I'll tell Dix to put out what's there. Bread and whatever's already made, the men understand. She considered this and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she didn't have the energy to resist it. Her arms had said their piece, her back had filed its formal complaint. Her hand was bandaged and throbbing with the steady, informational throb of a cut that had been cleaned and was now doing its own business. All right, she said, the second time she'd said it to him tonight. It was getting easier, those 2 words. He stood, moved toward the door, paused there, his doorway habit, which she had learned to read as the place where he reconsidered things, and said, without turning, what you did tonight, taking charge like that. A pause. I won't forget it. You'd have done the same if you hadn't. But I didn't. You did. He said it with the exactness of a man who had decided not to soften a fact for his own comfort. That matters. The door closed. The rain came against the window. She sat at her own work table in the warmth of the banked stove and looked at her bandaged hand and listened to the rain and the distant sounds of men settling the ranch for a hard night. She thought about Clara, who had been afraid of fire and had died in one. She thought about the particular cruelty of that and the particular cruelty of surviving things and carrying them afterward, and how the 2 cruelties were different but both real. She thought about Callahan standing in the yard, frozen, somewhere else, and then coming back. She thought about what she'd said to him, that it counted for the thing it counted for, and she found that she believed it, not because it made everything all right, but because the alternative was a standard of perfection under crisis that no real person met, and real people were what she had to work with, herself included. Outside, the rain intensified. The barn would stay wet through the night without the water chain, which was something. The horses were in the paddock, settled now, the mares no longer panicked. The silo was whole. She put her good hand flat on the work table and felt the grain of the wood under her palm, the familiar scarred surface, hers now in the way that places became yours, not by ownership, but by the accumulation of mornings. She was still here. That was enough for tonight. The morning after the fire, Iron Creek Ranch woke up different. Not better, exactly, say. The east barn wall was a blackened ruin. The hayloft was a gutted cavity open to the sky, and the yard had the particular wrecked look of a place that had been worked hard through the night and not yet had time to recover. 3 of the men had slept less than 2 hours. Petey had a burn on his forearm from an ember that had caught him during the horse rescue. Minor, dressed, but real. Cortez had pulled something in his shoulder on the water chain. The ground was a uniform mud from the rain that had come and gone in the night, but something was different in the way the men came into the cookhouse that morning. She noticed it in the first wave, Dix and the Hatch boys and Cortez, who came in at their usual time and sat in their usual seats, but the room had a different quality to it, a different temperature that had nothing to do with the stove. They were quieter than usual, but not sullen. Cortez sat down and looked at his plate and then looked up at her and said simply, "Thank you," and went back to eating. He was not a man who talked much. She understood what those 2 words had cost him in terms of the kind of man he considered himself to be, and she accepted them the way they were offered, directly, without making more of it than it was. Petey came in with his arm wrapped and tried to pretend the wrapping wasn't there, which she let him do through most of breakfast before she said, "Let me look at that before you go out," and he went red in the way of young men who had been caught being stoic. "It's fine," he said. "I know. Let me look anyway." He let her. The burn was what she'd expected, a long, shallow one, the kind that would heal cleanly if kept clean. She redressed it with the supplies Callahan had left on the cookhouse shelf. He had brought the whole box back and set it there without comment, which she had noticed. And Petey sat very still through the process with the stiff dignity of someone determined not to make noise. "Your mother would have done the same thing," she said. He looked at her sideways. "Fussed over it," she said, "and then told you to stop making a face." His mouth pulled at one corner. "She would have said worse than that. Good mothers usually do." He left with his arm properly wrapped and the expression of a young man who had been seen rather than managed, and she thought that was probably worth more than the bandaging. Garrett came in late, in the second wave. He sat at his usual spot, which was at the end of the table nearest the door. She had always read that as a man who liked an exit available, and she put his plate down the same as everyone else and turned back to the stove. She heard him eat. The room had its usual morning sounds around him. When she came back to clear the far end, he was the last one left. "The silo," he said, without looking up. She stopped. "What I did on the south wall." He was talking to his coffee cup, which was something she understood. Some conversations were easier when you directed them at an object rather than a person. "That was the right call." "It was," she said. "You made the right call telling me to do it." She waited. He finally looked up, and his face had the blunt, uncomfortable honesty of a man who had been rehearsing something since approximately 3 a.m. and had decided just to say it. I don't have a good word for it. Not fair isn't quite right. More like I decided something about you before I had information." "You decided a lot of things," she said, without heat. "I did." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "My father ran a ranch in Nebraska. Cook was a man named Tom Moss. 40 years on that ranch. Knew everything, ran the kitchen like a general, and nobody questioned him." He paused. I thought that was what a ranch cook was. I had that picture and you didn't fit it, and He stopped. "I'm not explaining this well." "You're explaining it fine," she said. "You had a picture of what things should look like, and I wasn't it." He looked at her. "I've been that my whole life," she said. "Wrong size, wrong look, wrong kind of person for the picture someone already had in their head." She pulled the empty plate from in front of him. "I don't need you to apologize for it. I just need you to stop making my work harder than it has to be." He was quiet for a moment. "I can do that," he said. She nodded and took the plate to the washboard. She heard him push back his chair, heard his boots on the floor, heard the door. She kept washing. She didn't trust it completely. People said things in the morning after a crisis that they sometimes forgot by the following Tuesday. But she had been surprised before, in both directions. And she was willing to wait and see what Garrett turned out to be when the smoke and the adrenaline and the particular honesty of exhaustion wore off. That was the morning. The afternoon brought something she hadn't anticipated. She was doing the inventory, a weekly task she had instituted herself, going through the pantry and the dry storage with the same methodical attention she brought to everything. Not because she was obsessive, but because knowing exactly what she had was the foundation of every decision she made. when she heard Callahan's voice from the yard, and then another voice she didn't recognize. She went to the cookhouse window and looked out. A man on a horse, well-dressed in the specific way of men who wanted you to notice they were well-dressed. The good coat, the hat that was a statement rather than a tool. He was maybe 50, thick through the middle, with the expansive ease of someone who was accustomed to being where he went and having that be fine. He and Callahan were talking, and the conversation had the body language of two men who knew each other and did not particularly like each other, the maintained distance, the angle of the shoulders. Dix appeared at the cookhouse door while she was still watching. "Ferris Holt," he said, coming in and helping himself to the coffee she kept on the back of the stove. "Who's that?" "Neighbor, I use the word loosely, runs the Holt operation to the southwest." Dix drank his coffee standing up, which he did when he was mildly unhappy about something. "Been trying to buy Callahan out for 3 years." She looked back out the window. "He doesn't seem like a man who takes no for an answer." "He is not." Dix watched the yard with her. "He comes around every few months, makes the offer better each time. Callahan keeps saying no." "Why does Callahan keep saying no?" Dix tilted his head slightly, the way he did when a question had a longer answer than the moment called for. "Iron Creek was his father's, and his grandfather's before that. And Clara—" He paused. "Clara loved it here. Callahan built the new barn the year after she died, rebuilt the north fence, put in the second water trough. He's been building things ever since she went." A pause. "Like he thinks if he makes it solid enough, it stays, you know?" She knew. "Holt knows about the fire?" she asked. "Word travels. He's been watching for a chance." Dix drank the rest of his coffee. "The fire damage makes the land look more vulnerable. I expect that's why he's here today rather than next month." She filed this away and went back to her inventory, but she kept a part of her attention on the yard, the way she kept a part of her attention on the stove when she was working on a secondary task, a background awareness that would alert her if something needed her. Callahan came into the cookhouse 20 minutes later. He had the tight, controlled quality of a man who had been civil for longer than he wanted to be. He stood at the window and looked out at the yard where Holt was riding away, already diminished by distance, but still that specific shape. The good coat, the hat. "He wants to buy," she said, not as a question. "He always wants to buy." Callahan turned from the window. He looked at her properly then, not the doorway glance, but the direct look. "He's offering good money this time." "More than the ranch is worth to you?" He held her gaze for a moment. "No." "Then that's your answer. The barn repair is going to cost. The winter supply order, with the hayloft gone, I'm looking at buying more feed than I budgeted." He sat down at the far end of the table, the meal's seat, she thought of it as. She had begun to categorize the places people habitually chose the way she categorized everything that would be useful to know. And he put his hands flat on the table the way a man did when he was thinking through something physical, something that existed in the world and had to be dealt with there. "The ranch is fine. I'm not saying it isn't, but Holt knows timing, and his timing is good. What does he say when he makes the offer?" "He makes it sound reasonable." A pause. "He always makes it sound reasonable. He's that kind of man." She sat down on the bench across from him, which was not something she normally did. She ate in the kitchen standing up, if she ate at all during service, but it felt like the right thing to be at the same level. "Is it reasonable? The offer?" He looked at her with the slight narrowness of someone not sure where the question was going. "The money is reasonable. What's unreasonable about it?" "Everything." The word came out flat, and then he tried to say it better. "What he'd do with it. He runs his operation the way he runs everything, stripping it back to what makes money fastest. The grazing land on the north end, the creek land, the timber on the ridge. He'd sell it all off in sections within 2 years." He looked at the table. "My grandfather ran cattle on the north end. My father built the first fence line on the creek property. Clara had a kitchen garden by the east wall of the house. She kept that garden every year." He stopped. "I know none of that is a business argument." "No," she said, "but it's a real argument." He looked at her. "Not everything that matters shows up in the numbers," she said. "You know that. Holt knows that too, which is why he's careful to keep the conversation on numbers." He was quiet for a moment. "You've dealt with men like Holt." It wasn't quite a question, She thought about the banker Greer with his leather satchel and his sympathetic tone that was the performed version of sympathy. She thought about the hotel owner in Callaway with his numbers and his reasonable explanations. Yes, she said, I've dealt with men like Holt. What did you do? I lost mostly. She said it without self-pity, which was not the same as saying it easily. The times I lost were when I didn't have anything to fight with. The time I didn't lose, she thought about it. I had something he needed that he couldn't get anywhere else. Callahan looked at her with a focused attention. What was that? Patience, she said. He needed the deal to close by a certain date. I didn't. She spread her hands. So I waited, and the date passed, and he needed something else by then. He absorbed this. Holt isn't on a date. He might be on something equivalent. Men like him usually are. There's always a next deal, a next acquisition, and the pressure moves around even if you can't see it from the outside. She looked at him. I'm not saying wait forever. I'm saying don't let his timing become your timing. He was quiet for a long moment. The cookhouse was warm around them, and the window showed the yard in late afternoon light, the scorched barn wall that was someone's morning work to start repairing, the mud that was already drying around the edges. A working ranch in the day after a difficulty, doing what working things did, continuing. How do you know how to do that? He asked. Think through things like that. She considered how to answer. 11 months of having very little and having to make every choice count, she said. And before that, 11 years of running a house on what my husband made, which was not enough, which I didn't know until the end. She smoothed the table with her good hand. When you don't have margin for error, you get very precise about where the actual problem is. Something moved across his face. I didn't know about your husband. You didn't ask. No. He paused. I didn't ask much of anything. I gave you a 1-week trial and watched you. That was fair, she said. You didn't know me. I still don't, not fully. No, she said. Not fully. The conversation had a different quality than their earlier ones. Less managed, less transactional, the two of them sitting in the ordinary late afternoon of the ranch kitchen, like two people who had been through something together and had come out the other side still speaking, which was what they were. My husband's name was Robert, she said, not because he'd asked, but because it seemed like the moment for it. He was a good man in most of the ways that counted. Not good with money, not good at telling me when things were bad. She looked at her bandaged hand. I was angry for a long time after I found out about the debts. Then I was just sad. Because he'd been scared and he hadn't told me, and I would have helped if he'd told me. But he thought it would frighten me, and it turned out his fear of my fear was worse than anything I would actually have felt. She paused. People do that. Keep things to protect you from knowing. And then the thing happens anyway and you're unprepared on top of grieving. Callahan was very still across the table. I kept things from Clara, he said. It came out quiet. Ranch problems, money problems, one bad year when the herd took sick. Wanted to handle it. He stopped. She knew anyway. She always knew. She just let me think I was protecting her. Something crossed his face that was exhaustion and fondness and grief all at once, the complicated blend of a man remembering someone clearly. She was smarter than me about most things. Most good marriages seem to work that way, Mabel said. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. Not quite, but adjacent. She would have liked you, he said. She liked people who said what they meant. Mabel felt the weight of that, the gift of it, the fact of it, offered across a table in a ranch kitchen 2 days after a fire. She didn't deflect it or diminish it. Thank you, she said. He nodded, and because he was who he was, he moved things back toward the practical, but more gently than usual. The barn repair. I'm going to need to draw down the reserve account. All right. The carpenter I use is in Millhaven. He's good, but he's not fast. I know someone who might be faster, she said. If you want a name. The logging camp I passed through on my way here. The foreman there, a man named Sutter. He did good structural work from what I saw, and he mentioned he took repair jobs in the off-season. He looked at her. The logging camp east of the Iron Creek Road. That one. You passed through there. I made their breakfast one morning in exchange for a ride. He absorbed this small piece of the year she'd had, offered without ceremony. That's the kind of year you had. It was, she said. He was quiet for a moment. I'll send word to Sutter. She got up and went back to the stove because dinner needed to happen regardless of conversations, and he sat at the table for a little while longer before he got up and went out. And she thought that two people who had learned to keep things to themselves being slowly honest with each other was its own kind of work. Not easier than the other kinds, just different. November came in cold and efficient. The barn repair started in the second week. Sutter turned out to be everything she'd suggested, a compact, laconic man with a reliable crew who assessed the east wall damage with the professional detachment of someone who had seen worse and said so, which was more reassuring than any amount of optimism would have been. They worked fast. By the end of the second week, the wall was framed and sheathed, the new hayloft floor laid, the eave rebuilt. The work had the solidity of things done right. The ranch recovered its rhythm, or found a new one, not exactly the same as before the fire, because the fire had changed some things that didn't unchange, but a functioning rhythm, a daily pulse of work and rest and work again. Some of what changed was small. Petey had appointed himself, without discussion or official assignment, something like her second pair of hands. Not in the kitchen, but in the carrying of heavy things, the hauling of water, the moving of supplies on supply day. He did it without making it obvious, and she let him without making it acknowledged, which was the arrangement they'd arrived at independently, and both found workable. The Hatch boys began leaving things on the cookhouse step. Small, useful things, a bundle of dried kindling one morning, a good piece of cedar for the cutting board she'd mentioned needing, once an entire half bushel of late apples from where she didn't know. They never knocked or waited for credit. The things just appeared. Cortez, whose relationship with language was limited, had begun doing something she found she was moved by in ways she didn't entirely examine. He tasted things, just the occasional spoonful when she was developing something new, a serious, concentrated tasting. And then he looked at her with his serious face and made a decision about what he tasted, and the decision was always right. She had started asking him when she was trying something new, and he had accepted the asking without ceremony or surprise, as though this was something they had always done. Even Garrett had found a kind of equilibrium. He didn't help, particularly, he wasn't a man who helped. It wasn't his nature, but he had removed himself from active opposition, which in its own way was its own form of support. He ate what she made without comment, which from him was as close to praise as the architecture of his personality allowed. All of this she registered and held without saying much about it to anyone. What she was less practiced at was what was happening with Callahan. It had been building slowly, the way things built when neither person was acknowledging the building. Accretion, small additions, nothing she could point to as a turning point. He had started coming into the kitchen before dinner sometimes, not for any declared reason, just standing in the doorway and talking about the ranch, the day's work, the herd, the repair progress. She talked back. They had discovered that they had the same approach to information, preferring specifics over impressions, preferring honesty over comfort, and that this made conversation efficient in a way that she hadn't had with many people and suspected he hadn't either. He had told her more about Clara, not all at once, not as a recitation, but in pieces. A detail here, a memory there, the way someone emptied a room that had been closed for a long time, item by item, at a pace they could manage. She had listened carefully each time and not asked for more than he offered, and she had offered things back. Robert, the house, the year on the road, not in exchange but in parallel, one person's particular weight and another person's, laid down in the same room for a moment. It was not a comfortable process. Real honesty rarely was. The evening in early November that something shifted more definitively, they were both in the main yard at the end of a long day. She had been dealing with a supply delivery, the full approved order, which had arrived on the right day for once, a small miracle, and he had been finishing something with the new fence on the north pasture line. They met in the yard at almost the same time in the early darkness, both carrying the day's accumulated tiredness, and they stood near the water trough in the cold and looked at the barn, the repaired barn, Sutter's crew's solid work, the new wood pale against the old. "It's better than before," Callahan said. He meant the barn, the structural quality of it. "The old eave was rotten," she said. "You couldn't tell from the outside, but when I was up there you could feel it." He looked at the barn, and she looked at the barn, and the night was cold and clear, the first stars coming in over the eastern ridge with the unhurried permanence of things that were going to be there regardless. "When you were on the roof," he said, "during the fire, I watched you from the yard when I came back to myself. You moved like you knew exactly what you were doing." "I was terrified," she said. "I moved like I was terrified and had decided to do it anyway." He turned and looked at her. In the low light, his face was less guarded than usual. The careful nothing relaxed into something more unguarded, tiredness having taken down some of the scaffolding. "That's the same thing as courage," he said. She looked back at him. The yard was quiet around them. Somewhere in the barn, one of the horses shifted, a soft percussion of hoof on wood. "Wade," she said, using his first name, which she had not done before. She watched something in his face change at the sound of it. Not surprise, or not only that, something more fundamental, the particular quality of a person hearing their own name in someone else's voice and not being braced for what it would do. "I need to ask you something." "Go ahead." She gestured slightly, a gesture that encompassed the yard, the barn, the ranch, the conversation, all of it. "Whatever this is becoming, I need to know if you're—" She stopped. This was harder than the roof. The roof had been fear with a clear action attached. This was fear without the action spelled out, which was worse. "I need to know if you're doing this because I'm here and you're lonely, or because of something else." He was quiet for a long moment. He had the quality of a man who had been asked something real and was treating it with the seriousness it deserved, not scrambling for the answer that would land well, but actually sitting in the question. "Both," he said, finally. "If I'm being honest, you're here, and yes, it's been a long 4 years, that's real." He met her eyes. "But lonely men don't talk to everyone the way I've talked to you this past month. Lonely men take what's available. This is—" He stopped, tried again. "You see things clearly. You say what you see. You made a decision on a burning roof that I couldn't make standing in the yard." He paused. "That's not loneliness. That's something I haven't found before." She was quiet. "What about you?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "I'm not in a position to trust easily," she said. "I trusted my husband and he didn't tell me things. I trusted that my work would speak for itself and it didn't, not for most of the past year." She looked at the barn. "I don't know yet what this is, but I haven't been—" She chose the word carefully. "I haven't been wrong about you, I don't think. You're difficult, and you close up, and you stood in the yard during the fire, and that was hard to see. But you came back, and you've been honest with me when it would have been easier not to be." "That's not a lot," he said. "No," she agreed, "but I've been working with less." She looked at him. "I'm not asking for anything from you except what's already here. I'm just asking that it's real." "It's real," he said, with the simplicity of a man who had gotten very tired of saying things that weren't. She nodded. They stood in the cold yard a moment longer, two imperfect people with their imperfect histories, looking at a barn that had burned and been rebuilt better than it was before. Then she said, "Supper's been holding for an hour." And he said, "I know." And they walked toward the cookhouse together across the dark yard, not touching, not needing to. The distance between them different than it had been an hour ago, in a way that couldn't be measured in feet. Inside, the stove was warm and the food was ready and the lamps were lit, and that was enough. It was more than enough. It was, Mabel thought, setting the plates, exactly the kind of life that looked like nothing from the outside and felt, from the inside, like something she had not dared to want until recently. She was still figuring out what to do with the wanting. That was all right. She had time. Winter came to Iron Creek the way winters came to that part of the country, without apology and ahead of schedule. By the first week of December, the north pasture had frost on it before dawn, and by mid-month there was a permanent cold that settled into the buildings and the ground and the bones of the people working there. The kind of cold that couldn't be fully driven out by any stove, only managed. Mabel had grown up with winters like this. She knew how to feed people through them. Heavier food, more fat and more warmth, meals that functioned as a second coat. She adjusted everything without being asked. The men ate accordingly and said nothing, which was its own form of gratitude. What she noticed through those first weeks of winter was how much the ranch had changed since October. Not dramatically. Not in ways anyone would have written down or marked on a calendar, It was the accumulation of small things, the kind that didn't announce themselves. The way the bunkhouse had a different sound in the evenings now, less the silence of men who had given up on the day, and more the sound of men who were tolerably comfortable in it. The Hatch boys had started a card game on Thursday nights that other hands drifted into and out of. Cortez, who she had understood was a profoundly solitary man, had begun teaching Petey something with rope and horses in the afternoon light after the day's main work was done, standing in the paddock with the patient economy of a man passing something on. Dix told her, one morning over his first coffee, that the men had stopped turning over as fast. 2 seasons, maybe 3. That's usually how long someone stays, he said. Cortez is on his 4th year now. Petey'll be his 2nd in the spring. And the Hatch boys? Going nowhere. He drank his coffee. That's new. She knew it was new, and she knew, without requiring anyone to confirm it, that it was connected to something she had been doing for the past 2.5 months. Not because she thought of herself as indispensable. Indispensable was a word that made her nervous, too close to the edge of what could be taken away, but because she understood something about what steady, decent food communicated to people who worked hard in isolated places. It said, "You are worth the effort." It said, "Someone counted you." That was not a small thing. That was, for some of these men, the only version of that message they were currently receiving. She was thinking about this, standing at the stove, second batch of biscuits in, a soup building slowly on the back burner, when Callahan came in and she could tell from the particular quality of his walk that something was wrong. He sat at the table. She put coffee in front of him and went back to the stove and waited. "Holt came back?" he said. She kept her hands moving. "When?" "Yesterday afternoon, while you were doing the supply count. I should have told you last night." She turned around. He was looking at the coffee cup, both hands around it in the way he held things when he was working through something. "What did he say?" "The offer's gone up again. He's added the East grazing land to the valuation." A pause. "But that's not the thing." "What's the thing?" He looked up. "He has a buyer for the timber on the ridge, a company out of Denver. He said he's been in negotiation with them for 6 months." He paused. "Which means he's been planning to sell that land off before I've agreed to anything. He's already treating it like his." She was quiet for a moment. "That's not legal." "Not quite legal, no. But Holt lives in the space between not quite and legal the way most men live in a house." He set down the cup. "He showed me the letter from the Denver company. It had Iron Creek on it." His voice was even, but she could hear what was underneath it. Not anger, something colder and more specific than anger, the particular feeling of a man who has been maneuvered. "He'd been using my name in negotiation for timber rights I haven't sold and don't intend to sell." She turned fully away from the stove. "Do you have those letters?" "I have the one he showed me. He kept the others." "What does your deed say? The ridge timber, is it specifically enumerated?" He looked at her with a slight adjustment of attention, the look of a man recalibrating what a conversation was going to require of him. "You know about property deeds." "I learned about property deeds approximately 48 hours after I discovered my husband owed money on things I didn't know we'd borrowed against." She kept her voice flat and informational. "I know what it means when the thing you're standing on turns out not to be titled the way you thought." He got up from the table. "The deed's in the house." "Let me get it." He came back with a document that had the worn softness of something handled many times, the edges darkened with the oils of hands going back 20 years. She spread it on the work table, clearing the flour to one side without ceremony, and she read it carefully. Not fast. She had learned not to read things fast. The timber rights were on the deed, specifically enumerated, as she'd asked, a long parcel description running along the northeast ridge that had been her first question because that was where someone would try to separate things. "It's yours," she said, clearly. "I know it's mine." "Then Holt using your name in negotiation with a third party is fraud." She looked at him. "That's not a maybe. That's what it is." He was quiet. "I'm not going to law over it. It'd take—" "You don't have to go to law," she said. "You have to write a letter." She looked at him. "To the Denver company, informing them that the negotiations were conducted without your authorization, that the timber rights in question are not available for sale, and that any agreement entered into on those terms is null. She paused. You send it directly to them, not through Holt. You copy the county land office so there's a record. He looked at her for a moment. You know how to write that letter? I know how to write that letter. How? She looked at the deed, then at him. The banker who took my house. His name was Greer. When I finally understood what had happened with Robert's debts, I spent a week reading every document I'd been handed and figuring out which parts were legitimate and which parts were him doing what Holt does, living in the space between not quite and legal. She smoothed the deed with her hand. I didn't win that fight. I didn't have the resources or the time, but I learned how the fight worked. She met his eyes. You have the resources, and I have the time. He held her gaze for a long moment. Something in it. She could see him deciding something that was larger than the letter, larger than Holt, something that had been building in him for weeks, the way things built in a man who was careful about what he committed to. Write the letter, he said. Please. She wrote it that afternoon at the work table between the lunch and dinner services, with a piece of decent paper she asked Callahan to bring from the house, and the careful, plain language she had found was more effective than formal language because it was harder to mistake or reinterpret. She stated the facts. She named what Holt had done without editorializing. She made the legal position clear without claiming to be a lawyer. She asked Callahan to read it twice and change anything that wasn't accurate. He changed nothing. You're better at this than I expected, he said, and she gave him the look that deserved, and he said, I meant that as a compliment. I know what you meant, she said. It still has an expected in it. His mouth pulled at the corner. I'm still learning, he said, and she found that was enough. They sent the letter by courier to Denver and a copy to the county land office in Mill Haven. Callahan sent a separate, shorter note to Holt. Not accusatory. She had advised against accusatory. It gave too much away. But clear. The ridge timber was not for sale. Any further negotiations on that basis should cease. Holt's response came back in 12 days. It was brief and professionally worded and communicated between its careful lines, the specific frustration of a man who had been outmaneuvered on the technical ground he thought he owned exclusively. He did not threaten action. Men like Holt rarely threatened openly because the threat was the negotiating tool, and once used, it was spent. He left the door open, as they always did. Callahan showed Mabel the letter. She read it and handed it back. He'll come back in the spring, she said, with a different approach. I know. But he lost this round cleanly. Yes. Callahan folded the letter. There was a particular quality to the way he held himself that she hadn't seen before. Not triumph, something quieter than that. The settling of a man who had been braced for a hit and found it hadn't landed. Thank you, he said, for the letter, for knowing how. You paid for the knowledge, she said, in a roundabout way. Robert and Greer and a year on the road. That's the tuition. He was quiet for a moment. I hate that you paid that much to learn something you shouldn't have needed to know. She looked at him. The kitchen was warm around them, and outside the December light was doing the thin, specific thing December light did, and she thought about what to say to that, about how to talk about the cost of things you'd been through, whether they were worth what they took from you, whether the question even had an answer. I don't know if I hate it, she said finally. Some of what I learned, I needed. Some of it I could have done without. She looked at her hands. The left one still had the scar from the fire, the cut Dix had first noticed, healed now to a pale line across the palm. What I know is that I'm here, and here is better than most of where I've been. He looked at her with the full attention he brought to things that mattered. Yes, he said simply, it is. The day Aldous Greer came back through was the last week of January, on a morning cold enough that his breath showed from 50 feet away, riding a horse that was not the same horse he'd been walking beside when she'd met him by a campfire in a field outside Hester's mill. She saw him coming up the ranch road and stood in the cookhouse doorway and felt something that took her a moment to identify. The specific warmth of an unexpected continuity, a thread pulled through from one part of your life to another. He rode up to the cookhouse and looked at her in the doorway and said, You stayed. I stayed, she said. How's the kitchen? Better than the field, she said. Come in. He looked older than she remembered, Or perhaps the same, and she was seeing him more clearly now, having recovered enough steadiness to notice things she'd been too worn down to notice then. He ate her food slowly and with appreciation, and she sat across from him in the way she rarely sat with anyone, and they talked. "The ranch," he said. "It suits you." "Most of it." She wrapped her hands around her cup. "What doesn't suit me, I'm working on." He looked at her with the assessing gaze she remembered from the campfire, the look of a man who noticed the particular things. "And Callahan?" She raised her eyes. He kept his gaze even, not prying, just seeing. "You knew what you were pointing me toward," she said. "I knew he needed something he didn't have words for," Aldous said. "And you were sitting in a field making the best beans I'd eaten in 10 years, and you were furious and exhausted and trying not to show either." He drank his coffee. Seemed like two people who might know how to be honest with each other if they ended up in the same place long enough. That's a lot to assume from a bowl of beans. I've made bigger assumptions on less evidence. He set the cup down. Was I wrong? She thought about the ward after the fire, and the work table with the deed spread open, and the cold yard in November, and a man using her name with the simplicity of someone who had forgotten to be guarded for a moment. "No," she said. "You weren't wrong." He left 2 hours later, heading north on some trajectory she didn't ask about, because Aldous was the kind of person who existed at the edge of other people's stories, who appeared when they were useful and then went somewhere else. And chasing that kind of person with questions seemed like the wrong response to them. She stood in the yard and watched him go. And the morning was cold and bright, and the barn's new wood was pale in the winter light, and the north pasture showed 3 of the hands working the fence line in the distance, small figures in the landscape. She went back inside and got on with the day. March came with mud and the first tentative warmth that the land received skeptically, having been burned by false springs before. The cattle were moved to the south pasture where the grazing was coming back. Sutter came back to do the final finish work on the barn, some interior work he'd planned to return for, shelving in the new hayloft, reinforcement on the east wall framing, and he worked for 4 days, and she fed his crew alongside the ranch hands and charged Callahan nothing extra for it, because feeding 4 more people was not fundamentally different from feeding 20. Callahan noticed this and said something about it, and she said it was more efficient than the alternative, and he let it go, which was how they had learned to navigate the small disagreements. Not always agreeing, but knowing when the other person had made a real decision and when they were still open. It was on the last evening of Sutter's visit that the thing happened that she had not seen coming, which was probably the point. The day had been long for everyone. Sutter's crew had finished the barn work, and they'd celebrated in the quiet way working men celebrated. A shared bottle at the bunkhouse, nothing elaborate. The satisfaction of a job completed clean. Mabel had made a proper dinner, the kind that required most of the afternoon. A roasted joint, root vegetables done in the drippings, fresh bread. The kind of meal that said, this was worth doing right. The table had been full and loud, and she'd stood at the stove listening to it with the feeling she'd come to associate with this particular room at this particular hour. The sense of a thing functioning the way it was meant to function, a wheel turning true. The men had gone to the bunkhouse. Sutter's crew had bedded down in the spare barn space. The cookhouse was quiet, just the stove settling and the last lamp burning. And she was finishing the cleanup with the methodical calm of a woman who had done this 10,000 times and found it meditative rather than tedious. She heard his boots on the step and then the door, and she didn't look up from the pan she was drying. Dinner was exceptional, Callahan said. Dinner was dinner. It was just done well. That's what exceptional means, he said. She looked at him then. He was standing inside the door, not in the doorway, she noticed, fully inside, which was not his habit. And he had a quality about him she recognized from the November yard, that unguardedness that came from tiredness and intention in combination. He had something in his hand. He looked at it and then at her. I've been trying to figure out when the right time for this was, he said. I've been trying to figure that out since approximately December, and I've concluded that there isn't a right time. There's just a time, and this is the one I've got. She set down the pan. Wade. Let me finish. She waited. You came here with a flour sack and a dented pot, he said. You reorganized my kitchen and fixed my supply chain and wrote a letter that stopped Holt from stealing my timber and climbed onto a burning roof because somebody had to. He looked at her steadily. I was not I was not kind to you at the beginning. I was not unkind, but I was watching you the way I watch everything, waiting for the place where it breaks. And you didn't break, and you didn't leave, and you didn't. He stopped. You didn't become smaller to fit what I expected. You stayed what you were. I didn't have anything else to be, she said. No. But you could have hidden it. People do. You didn't. He took a step toward the work table, set the thing he'd been holding on it. She looked at it. A small box, plain wood. The kind a man bought when he wasn't sure about the doing of a thing, but was sure enough to go to town and find something adequate. I'm not good at this, he said. I know that. I am still, in some ways, a man who stands in doorways and doesn't fully come in. I know that about myself. You're getting better at it, she said. Something crossed his face. I am? You're in the room, she said. That's not nothing. He held her gaze. I want you to stay. Not as the cook. I know that sounds like... He shook his head. I mean, I want you to stay because this ranch is better with you in it. Because I am better when you're here. Because you see things I miss and you say things I need to hear and you make decisions that I... He stopped again. The particular stop of a man who has rehearsed and now found that the rehearsed version was inadequate and was trying to say the real thing instead. Because when I came back to myself in the yard during the fire, you were the person I looked for. And I think that means something. The cookhouse was very quiet. The stove made its small sounds. She looked at the box on the table. She looked at him. She thought about the road she'd come down, all 11 months of it, its accumulated weight. Mrs. Crane's kitchen floor and the hotel boys and Greer's leather satchel and the clay road that sucked at her boots and the campfire outside Hester's mill and the flour sacks she'd set down just inside the cookhouse door on her first day and never picked up again. She thought about the things she'd told herself she'd stopped expecting. Not from bitterness. She was not, had never been, a bitter woman, though she'd had occasion enough to become one, but from a kind of pragmatic recalibration. The adjustment a person made when hoping for something specific became more costly than accepting what was available. She had stopped hoping for the specific thing, and then it had appeared anyway, sideways, wearing work boots and standing in doorways. You froze in the yard during the fire, she said. I know. And you waited 4 months to say this. I know that too. You tested 14 cooks before me. 15, counting the one who left before lunch. He looked at her evenly, not flinching from the ledger. I know what I am. I'm not asking you to pretend otherwise. She crossed to the work table and opened the box. A ring. Simple, plain gold, no ornamentation. The ring of a man who knew his own taste, which ran to honest materials and clean lines, and nothing that was there purely for show. She looked at it for a long moment. Robert's ring was silver, she said. It wasn't a comparison. It was just something she needed to say, a small acknowledgement of the person who had come before, the life that had ended badly and been carried all this way. I know, he said. She looked at him. You know? You've mentioned it, in passing, a couple of times. He paused. I pay attention to the things you say in passing. She picked up the ring, turned it once in her fingers. It was solid and real and the right weight, and she thought about weight. The weight of things carried and the weight of things taken on, and how different those felt in the hand. I'm difficult, she said. I have opinions about spices, and I will tell you when you're wrong, and I will reorganize whatever needs reorganizing, whether you've asked me to or not. I know. I'm not what anyone would have drawn up as the right woman for a cattle ranch. No one drew anything up, he said. You just arrived. She looked at him for a moment. The lamp threw a warm, imperfect light across the kitchen. The work table she'd reclaimed, the stove she knew by sound and smell, and the particular drag of its damper, the window where she'd stood so many mornings watching the yard come to life. Her kitchen. Hers in the way it had gotten into her hands, and her memory and her daily life. Yes, she said. He was quiet. Yes, she said again, clearer. That's my answer. Something happened to his face then. A slow undoing of years, she thought, watching it. The look of a man who had been carrying himself carefully for a very long time and was, perhaps, being allowed to set some of it down. Not all of it. You didn't set all of it down. She knew that as well as anyone. But some. He came across the kitchen, and she put the ring on her own finger before he could offer to, because that was who she was. And he looked at her doing it and didn't say anything, and she thought that was probably the best sign she'd had so far about how this was going to go. Key. Spring came properly in April and brought with it the kind of light that made the land look like it had been washed. The east barn wall had fully weathered into the rest of the structure, Sutter's new wood taking on the gray and brown of age faster than expected, which was a sign of good wood properly dried. Ferris Holt came in early April, as she'd predicted. He came with a different approach, as she'd also predicted. Not the straight offer this time, but a roundabout proposal about a joint arrangement on the south grazing, something that would require Callahan to extend access across his eastern fence line. She sat in on the conversation, at Callahan's request, and she listened to Holt carefully and watched him watch her, and said nothing until Holt finished. Then she said, "The east fence line runs inside your property boundary by how far?" Holt looked at her with the particular look men like him had for women who asked operational questions in operational settings, a fractional pause, a recalibration. "I'm not sure we've been introduced," he said. "We haven't," she said. "How far inside the boundary does the east fence run?" Callahan's face was doing nothing, which she had learned to read as the face of a man trying not to look satisfied. Holt answered her. He answered her because the question was specific, and refusing to answer it would communicate something he didn't want to communicate. She asked 3 more questions, each one drawing on the deed language she'd now read twice through, and by the end of it, Holt's proposal had developed visible structural problems that he'd need to address before he could bring it back, if he brought it back. He left. She and Callahan stood in the yard. "You enjoyed that," Callahan said. "A little," she admitted. He looked at the road Holt had taken, already empty. "He won't stop coming." "No, but we know how to answer him now." She looked at the ring on her hand. She had worn it every day since March, no ceremony yet, that was being planned in the careful, practical way they planned things. And she thought about the word "we." How strange it had seemed for most of the past 2 years. How gradually it had stopped being strange and started being accurate. "There's something I want to show you," Callahan said, and she followed him around the east side of the house to the strip of ground that ran between the east wall and the new fence line. Someone had been working it. The soil was turned, dark and loamy, and in the turned earth she could see the beginning rows of something planted. She crouched and looked close and recognized the seedling quality of it, the early spring promise. "I put it in last week," he said. He was standing back a little with the quality of a man presenting something he wasn't sure how it would be received. "I asked Cortez about the soil, the south-facing wall. It gets more light than you'd think." She looked up at him. "Clara's garden," she said. "The same spot. Yeah." He looked at the turned earth. "I've been leaving it since she died. I couldn't—" He stopped. "I thought I was keeping it for her, but I think I was just leaving it empty because it was easier than deciding what to do with it." She stood. The garden was small, maybe 8 feet by 12, nothing grand. But the soil was good and the light was right and it was real. "What did you plant?" she asked. "Things you use," he said. "Thyme, bay. Some others Cortez said you'd mentioned being short of." He paused. "I didn't know what Clara had there. She kept track of that herself. I should have asked her more. I know that now." He looked at the garden and then at Mabel. "But I thought, it doesn't have to be what it was. It can be something new." She looked at the rows of small green beginnings. She thought about the things that grew and turned soil. Not the romantic version of that, the actual version, the one that required work and water and time and some tolerance for the things that didn't come up right or got taken by weather or failed for reasons that weren't anyone's fault. The version that required you to show up regardless. "I'll need to add some things," she said. "I have specific opinions about gardens." "I know you have specific opinions about everything," he said. That was not a complaint. She looked at him. The April light was on his face, and he looked like a man who had been somewhere very dark and had been coming back for a while. Not all the way, not perfectly, but in the right direction. That was the thing about people, she thought. They didn't arrive at their better selves in a moment, in a single choice, or a single fire, or a single conversation in a ranch kitchen. They arrived incrementally, step by step, sometimes two forward and one back, carrying what they couldn't put down and setting down what they finally could. She had arrived here with nothing she'd chosen to bring: a dented pot, a wooden spoon, a handful of dried beans, and the particular stubbornness of a woman who had run out of the energy required to be less than she was. That was not, she had come to understand, a small thing to arrive with. That was, in fact, the only essential thing. Because the world was full of people who would look at a woman like Mabel Turner and see what was wrong with the picture. Wrong size, wrong look, wrong kind for whatever room she was standing in. And the world would keep doing that, would probably never fully stop. Holt would come back in the fall with another approach. There would be other Garretts, other Mrs. Cranes, other men with leather satchels and sympathetic tones who were counting on you to accept their accounting of what you were worth. The only protection against that, the only real one, the one she'd found and held on to, was to know your own value from the inside, rather than waiting for someone else to name it. Not arrogance. Not the performed confidence of people who needed witnesses to feel certain, just the quiet daily knowledge of what you could do and what you were willing to do and what kind of person you were when the situation was difficult and no one was watching. She had fed 20 men on a cup of beans and a heel of hard bread and the knowledge in her hands. She had climbed a burning roof on arms that failed her on the way down. She had written a letter that stopped a man from stealing something he'd already spent. She had said yes in a warm kitchen to a difficult man who was getting better at coming inside. None of it had been smooth. None of it had looked like the version of the story where things worked out because the right person saw your value and rewarded it. It had looked like hard work and tired feet, and more than one morning when she'd held onto the ladder rails and breathed and kept going anyway. That was what it looked like, she thought. That was the actual shape of it, when people's lives changed. Not a door opening suddenly into light, but a long road with enough solid ground beneath it that you could keep walking. And occasionally, you rounded a turn and found yourself somewhere worth being. She knelt at the garden's edge and put her hand in the soil, which was cold still but warming, and felt the specific realness of it, the grit and the mineral smell and the small resistance of living earth. "I'll add sage," she said, "and rosemary along the wall edge. It'll come back every year." Callahan crouched beside her. Not gracefully. He was not a graceful man. He'd told her once that he'd never been graceful, that Clara used to say he moved through the world like someone who'd never quite made peace with having a body. And he looked at the soil alongside her with the specific attention he brought to things he was learning. "Every year," he repeated. "Every year," she said. The morning was quiet around them. Behind them, the ranch was beginning its day. She could hear Dick's at the barn, the sound of horses, Petey's voice from somewhere, all the sounds she knew now by their specific qualities, the same way she knew the sound of each burner on the stove, each floorboard in the cookhouse, each of the 20-some different ways this piece of land spoke in the morning. She did not think of it as hers exactly. It was too big for that, and she'd learned enough caution about what you could hold to be careful with that kind of claim. But she thought of herself as belonging to it, to this particular patch of the world that had taken her in and asked her to be exactly what she was, no more and no less. That was home, she thought, not ownership, not the absence of difficulty or the presence of everything you wanted. Just the place where you were asked to be yourself and where yourself was finally sufficient. She stayed crouched at the garden's edge for another moment, her hand in the cold April soil, and she felt, not happiness exactly, or not only that, but the larger thing that happiness was part of, the sense of being in the right place, doing the right work, with the right kind of life extending ahead of her, imperfect and real and genuinely, irreversibly hers. Then she stood, because the stove needed tending, and the morning bread was waiting, and 20-some people were going to be hungry, and she walked back toward the cookhouse in the spring light with Callahan beside her, and the day opened up ahead of them like a field that needed working, and she was ready for it.